Chapter 25. Hansford looked tired and haggard. During the days of Neath's illness, he'd suffered the greatest crushing of his spirit he'd ever had to endure. In the desolation of its aftermath, he knew he'd never be the same again. In the past, her mortality had crossed his mind more than once, but she'd survived several attacks related to her business. She'd even laughed about it afterwards. Her attempted annihilation, prompted solely because of what she was, took her safety beyond his power to protect her. With a heavy heart, he realized he was 1,000,000 miles away from being able to protect her, and that Baxter stood shoulder to shoulder with her. Hansford was more than aware of the physical bond they shared, but it was all animal attraction on her part. He hadn't eaten, slept, or had the compunction to wash. His well-worn routine that had served to keep him alive in some of the most dangerous and inhospitable places on earth had cracked and fallen as Neath dominated his every thought. Finally, he'd made the decision to rebuild his relationship with her. He'd start by becoming her ally. Back in his office, a thinner and considerably more solemn Hansford was thumbing through Donato Bianchi's autopsy report sent over by Glenda. He threw it back on Draper's desk. He'd found out why Pilgrim had been sent to Bianchi's. The fact she'd already at that point been exposed to the parchment was incidental. As far as he was concerned, he wanted Draper's explanation, which had better be good. Pilgrim has been of interest to this division since you decided to have more than a passing interest in her. I just connected some dots that you failed to mention. The Donato girl was not even an invitation. It was more of a summons. You must have known that. Draper finished, not used to having to explain himself to anyone. Let's face it, if she hadn't become quite so ill, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Hansford was furious. Draper's explanation was having difficulty penetrating his logic. As far as he was concerned, they'd used her as bait, and his protective instinct for her kicked into high gear. This division can fight its own battles in the future, he ground out. You've a blindness about her that borders on recklessness. Draper had never seen his top operative so angry, that can cost lives. Pilgrim's a grown woman, she can take care of herself. She's not infallible. She bleeds like the rest of us, Hansford stated through gritted teeth. But she's not like the rest of us, is she? Draper underlined. The silence hung in the air between them. Hansford wasn't about to divulge anything of what he'd seen at Merrillmar. He knew everything their department had about Pilgrim, which was now, he acknowledged, precious little. Her file hinted at supernatural abilities, but was pure conjecture on their part, as nothing had been substantiated. It was enough for Draper that the Titans may be even fearful of her. That's why he'd asked her in, because he knew she'd accept willingly, and any information that could be extracted concerning them would be highly valuable. The Titans never broke cover unless there was something they wanted, and Draper knew they wanted her. "How's she doing?" Draper asked. "She survived, just." "I'm presuming Baxter's looking after her." Hansford's gut folded as his face became a mask of stone. Draper thought it best to drop the subject. He'd underestimated her importance to Hansford. "Shall we get back to the task at hand?" Draper suggested. Hansford's recollection of the words at the end of Donato's report of wrongful death didn't come anywhere near in conveying the violence and brutality that had been inflicted on the body of that poor girl. His personal laws governed who he physically went up against. They were either shooting at him, or it was going to be a fair fight. Whoever the man was, his days were numbered. Draper placed the profile sheet in its file. Leaning back, he exhaled, saying, "I don't recognize this particular psychology. I've got bookshelves groaning with those approaching it, but taking into consideration the demographic of the Bianchi girl and the level of post-mortem destruction means the kill was personalised. We're going to need the best of the 20%, he concluded. 20%? Hansford puzzled. Finger runners. 80% of the population are influenced by all forms of graphics. They're visually led. The remaining 20% are not. This extrapolation can only be achieved by going through records, a lot of them, and picking out the anomalies. Don't we have computers for that sort of thing? Hansford asked. Hansford, you've dropped something on my floor. Hansford took a look around his shoes while Draper stood, placing both hands on his desk and bellowed, "Pick up your goddamn IQ!" Hansford shot him an undisguised glare of anger. "Remember, I'm not the bad guy here. Focus," Draper warned. "This man is buried deep. He is not going to show up on any computer." He shook his head at Hansford. Slumping into a seat, he balled his fist into his hand. "Something came up in Italy. A motive. It's called Liquid Door. It's—" Hansford began. "I know what it is. It could make sense if you're a Titan." Draper leaned back in his chair, taking time to hypothesize. There are easier ways of getting to Pilgrim. Baxter, for instance. Donata's death was unnecessary. If we're assuming the chain of events is valid, they could easily have taken the parchment from her and still delivered it into Pilgrim's hands, if indeed that's what caused her illness. But it's too sloppy. Which points to our man. Whoever he is, I don't fancy his chances for a long life. Hansford had to agree with him on that point. There are two divergent aspects of this case. The first is our maniac, and the second is why only partially incapacitate Pilgrim, unless it was a trial run. You're suggesting, if we're agreeing it was the Titans, that they only wanted to incapacitate her? It's the obvious explanation, which worries me. They're not known for doing the obvious. We need to chip away at this thing. Firstly, this man. He's practiced, learned, patient, and creative. Plus, he's a liability to them. You certainly have a way of wringing information out of an autopsy report, Hansford observed. They're not just my thoughts on it, but Glenda's as well, Draper pointed out. This man is dangerous, Hansford, in the extreme. Hansford recalled the photograph showing the distinct footprint of a brogue on Donata's t-shirt. Understood. This is premeditation on a scale I've not seen in a very long time. Draper's solemnity heightened Hansford's attention. We'll be lucky if we can find anything to track him. You mentioned he's a liability to the Titans. How do you know he didn't do this pro bono? Hansford asked. Notwithstanding we've discovered the connection, which they may have fully intended, he would have popped up on the grid by now if he'd been killing on his own like this, Draper pointed to the report. Besides, the girl's background doesn't support it in any way. No jealous ex. She'd be of no value dead and no intrinsic value alive. This isn't about money. Plus, there's no sexual motive or evidence, apart from the footprint, which was left intentionally. Donata must have had information, which meant she had to die. Which brings us back to the parchment, Hansford said. Draper paused as he leaned back in his chair. There were 2 murders committed on her body. The first was the blunt force trauma to the head, which killed her in one blow. The second was when he caved in her chest. Now that was his work, his psychology, completely unwarranted as she was already dead. This tells us a lot about him. He has compulsions he can't control. That makes him vulnerable and a liability. Perhaps he's hiding in a sanatorium for the criminally insane, Hansford said dryly. Observing him closely, Draper ruminated the idea before continuing. We need someone who is up to speed, who can look beyond what we already know before this guy disappears for good. No! Hansford was leaning intimidatingly across Draper's desk when he heard the unmistakable click of a gun behind him. "For God's sake, Hunter," Draper scowled. "Just making sure, sir," Hunter said, lowering his gun. "I'm going to ask Pilgrim to take a look. That's all," Draper reassured.